How many times a day do you find yourself talking to yourself? Like, seriously, how many times? While you're driving, walking, while you're working, while you're cooking or exercising, while you're trying to fall asleep. I think we all do it all the time. And it's kind of interesting because we probably spend more time talking to ourselves than to any other person in our lives. Some of those conversations last a few seconds, and others, yeah, others maybe last for years. Some are about simple things like what we're having for dinner, what we need to do tomorrow, what we forgot. And some are much deeper about decisions, relationships, change, fears, about dreams. And yet we rarely pay attention to what we're actually telling ourselves. We had hardly stopped long enough to listen to that voice that's always there. The one that shows up when everybody else stops talking. The one that appears when things finally become quiet. And today, that's exactly what I want to talk about. Those conversations, those thoughts, that voice that follows us everywhere we go. And that many times we know less than we think we do. Welcome to Sin Manual, No Playbook, a space where there are no perfect formulas, no step-by-step paths. Here, we talk about life as it is, with doubts, with mistakes, with moments of clarity, and others where we are in the middle just trying to understand what's next. This isn't a podcast to tell you what to do, it's a space to question, to feel, and maybe find your own answers, because at the end, no one gave us a manual, and still, we keep moving forward. Okay, here we go. A few days ago, I found myself thinking about something. Well, if I'm being honest, I found myself thinking about a lot of things, which I guess is exactly the problem. And I realized that something interesting. I talk to myself quite a bit, actually, a lot. And I am not talking about deep philosophical conversations. Like I'm not sitting under a tree trying to figure out the meaning of the universe. I'm just talking about normal conversations, like everyday conversations, the kind of most of us have all the time. Like for example, in the mornings when I am organizing my day, thinking about work, when I'm looking at everything that needs to get done, that's when the conversation starts. Like, hey man, you need to finish this today, or don't forget to call that person, or you still need to take care of that issue. Make sure this gets done. And little by little, I start organizing my day. Sometimes I think a big part of my job is coordinating people. And another big part of my job is coordinating myself, which honestly can be more difficult because other people don't always know what I'm thinking. I do, which means I have fewer excuses. The truth is, actually, I enjoy talking to myself. Like, when people say I like to talk to myself because I like listening to the experts. Although, to be fair, that expert gets things wrong quite often. And I think that's one of the most interesting things about our inner voice. Sometimes it's our best advisor, and sometimes it's very hard on ourselves. There are moments when I finish dealing with a situation, like something at work, a decision, a problem, a conversation, and I immediately tell myself, well, why do you keep doing things, or why do you keep doing these things when you already know how it ends? And the worst part is that most of the time I already know the answer because I've been there before, because I've already made that mistake, because I've already seen the outcome. I already learned that lesson, or at least I thought I had. But then again, I have to deal with that situation. And that's interesting because, like, we hear so many famous quotes about change, like about growth, about getting different results. But the reality is that many times the problem is in a lack of information. Many times we already know. We know exactly what we should be doing. We know what we should stop doing. We know which conversation we are avoiding. We know which decision we are postponing. We know which habit is hurting us. And yet, we keep going in circles. That's when that inner voice shows up. The one we don't always want to hear. The one that reminds us of things we already know. The one that points to the truth we've been trying to ignore. And I think one of the most valuable things about thinking out loud is exactly that. Listening to truths we already knew, but somehow stopped paying attention to. Here I have a question for you. What kind of conversations do you have with yourself throughout the day? Like when nobody is listening, when nobody is watching, when you don't have to impress anyone. Do you speak to yourself like someone who's trying to help you? Or do you speak to yourself like someone who's constantly judging you? And speaking of listening to that inner voice, there's something people have asked me about quite often before, which is meditation. Because every now and then someone tells me, I don't know how to meditate, or I've tried, but I can't do it. I wish I knew how. And honestly, I am not sure if I meditate the right way, assuming that there's even a right way. I like to meditate. But when some people talk about meditation, it sounds like they're describing something very complex, like a higher state of consciousness, a completely empty mind, a deep spiritual experience. Maybe for some people it is, and that's great. But for me, in my case, it's something much simpler. For me, meditation is about slowing things down. And that's it. It's about sitting quietly for a while, breathing, letting the day settle, and paying attention to what's happening inside my own head. Because some days move incredibly fast, like work, emails, phone calls, meetings, responsibilities, problems, decisions. And before you know it, the day is over. and you never stop long enough to ask yourself how you're actually doing. So I try to do that, especially at the end of the day, when things are quieter, when nobody needs anything from me right away, when I don't have to rush somewhere. And if there's a problem on my mind, I think about it. I don't try to avoid it. I don't try to distract myself from it. I think about it. So I think about possible solutions. I think about possible consequences, about what could go right or what could go wrong. And I think about which decision feels most aligned with who I want to be or what has to be done. Because difficult decisions rarely become easier by ignoring them. Actually, most of the time, it doesn't work like that. But they often become clearer when we give them time. And that has helped me in a big way over the years. Not because I always make the right decision, because I definitely don't do it, but because when the moment finally arrives, I've already walked through much of the journey in my mind. Like, I already explored scenarios, I've already considered outcomes, I've already imagined possibilities. And that gives me peace of mind. There's an idea that comes back to me often. Thinking doesn't always change what is going to happen, but it often changes how we arrive there. And I think that's a huge difference. And all of this reminds me of a book that I like a lot, The Count of Monte Cristo. I don't know if you've ever read it, but if you haven't, or maybe if you have watched the movie, I highly recommend it. It was written by Alexandre Dumas, the same author who wrote the Three Musketeers. And there are many things I love about that novel. But one of the most fascinating parts for me is the transformation of Edmond Dantès, the main character. Because when people talk about the book, they usually remember everything that happens later, like the adventure, the revenge, the travels, the strategy, like the big story. But I've always been caught to a different part, the prison, because that's where the real transformation happens. That's where he learns. That's where he develops patience, when he gains knowledge, and that's where he prepares himself in the prison. Now, obviously, I'm not comparing our minds to a prison, although some days they certainly try to feel like one. But I do think there's a lesson there, because many of us see quiet moments as wasted moments. Moments when we are alone, moments when we are reflecting, moments when we are simply thinking. But maybe those aren't wasted moments at all. Maybe they are moments of preparation. Maybe they are the moments when we are organizing our thoughts, understanding ourselves, making sense of what we are going through, or preparing for decisions that haven't arrived yet. And I think we forget that sometimes. Not all growth happens when we are doing something. Sometimes growth happens when we're thinking, when we are observing, when we are listening, especially when we're giving ourselves the space to process life. And maybe that's one of the reasons why those conversations with ourselves matter so much. When was the last time you truly listened to yourself? Without your phone, without social media, without television, basically without distractions. Just you and your thoughts. Just long enough to hear what your own voice has been trying to tell you. There's something I've been thinking about lately. Like, about being lonely. People talk a lot of these days about being alone, about solitude, about learning to enjoy your own company. And I think it's a topic that's often misunderstood because when someone says they enjoy doing things alone, a lot of people immediately assume something must be wrong, that they're sad, that they're lonely, that they're going through a difficult time, or like they're waiting for someone to show up. And that reminds me of something that happened to me a few years ago. I was on a vacation by myself, so I had decided to take a few days off to disconnect a little, to rest, to get away from my routine. So I arrived at this hotel, checked in, and while they were handing me the room key, the the person at the front desk asked me if I wanted to make a dinner reservation, and of course I said yes. And without even thinking, she asked, or actually she just said, "For two people, right?" And I said, "No, no, no, just for me." And I'll never forget the look on her face. It's kind of hard to describe, but it was somewhere between surprise, concern, and kind of feeling sorry for me. Like something had gone terribly wrong. Like I had just been stood up. Like I was in the middle of some heartbreaking story she hadn't heard yet. And before I knew it, I found myself explaining, like, no, 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 everything is fine. I'm on vacation. I'm actually enjoying myself. And after that conversation ended, I kept thinking about it because what shocked me, I think, wasn't her reaction. I think it was the fact that I felt the need to explain myself, as as if having a good time with my own company require a justification. And I don't think that was her fault. Of course, I think it's just a cultural thing. I think many of us have been taught to associate being alone with something negative, but they are not the same thing. Being alone, feeling lonely are two very different experiences. And I believe everyone should learn to spend time with themselves. Not because we're trying to isolate ourselves from the world, or not because we don't enjoy being around other people's, not because we want to disconnect from relationships, but because it's important to enjoy our own company too. To go for a walk by ourselves, to sit down for a coffee alone, to have a meal by ourselves, to take a drive with no destination, to simply be. Because very often, those are the moments when the most important conversations happen, the honest ones, the uncomfortable ones, actually, the conversations that get buried beneath the noise of every day. And there's something else I've noticed. People sometimes tell me, I don't have time to think. And maybe sometimes that's true, but I don't think it's always about time. I think sometimes we are afraid of silence. Because when silence finally arrives, so does that voice. The one reminding us of things we've been avoiding. The one reminding us of conversations we've been postponing. Reminding us about decisions we know we need to make, or that's something that we need to change. And listening to that voice isn't always comfortable, but I do think it's necessary. Because I don't believe most people are afraid of being alone. I think many of us are afraid of being alone with our thoughts. And yet, that's where some of the most important conversations of our lives begin. And that leads me to another thought. Because there isn't just the voice we hear when we are alone, there's also the voice we don't always allow to come out. The voice behind our ideas, our opinions, our perspective, the things we think but don't always say out loud. And while I was like preparing this episode, I found myself thinking about the previous one, Life Without Filters, because in that episode we talked a lot about image, about appearances, about the version of ourselves we present to the world, about how sometimes we try to look like something we are not. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized there is another filter we don't talk about nearly as much. The filters we place on our own thoughts. Because many times we think one thing and say another. We feel one thing and show something completely different. We have an idea and keep it to ourselves. And not because it's a bad idea, not because it has no value, but because we are afraid. Afraid of being wrong. Afraid of being judged. Afraid of rejection. Afraid that someone won't agree with us. And before anyone else has the chance to silence us, we do it ourselves. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not suggesting we should say everything that comes into our heads. That will probably create a whole new set of problems. But I do think there are many good ideas, many important conversations, many dreams, many projects that never get a chance to exist because they die inside our own minds. And as I'm telling you this, I just realized something. This podcast exists because of that. For years, I had thoughts like reflections, stories, experiences, observations, things I was learning about life. And most of them stayed right here inside my head. Until one day I decided to share them. Not because I had all the answers, I definitely don't. Not because I consider myself an expert on life, because certainly I'm not. But because I thought maybe, just maybe, something I had experienced might, resonate with someone else. And I think that's true for all of us. There are people listening right now who have conversations they've been postponing. People with projects they've been postponing, people with decisions they've been postponing, with dreams. Not because they don't know what to do, but because they haven't found the courage to take the first step. And many times, that first step begins with an honest conversation, a conversation with ourselves. Because when we stop making excuses, when we stop avoiding uncomfortable truth, when we stop pretending not to know, most of the time, we already know what needs to happen next. We may not like it. It may scare us. It may be uncomfortable. But deep down, we usually know. And that's something I've learned by listening to myself more carefully over the years. Sometimes I don't need information. I don't need another book, another podcast, another video. I don't need another opinion. Sometimes what I really need is more honesty. Because the answer, or at least the direction, is often already there. I've just been refusing to listen to it. What thought, what idea, or what decision have you been holding on to for far too long? What conversation are you still avoiding? What step do you already know you need to take but haven't taken yet? It might be worth answering yourself those questions. Because at the end of the day, that's really what this episode has been about. Not finding all the answers, not solving every problem, not having life completely figured out, but learning to listen to the voice that has been with us alone, even when it tells us things we rather not hear. Because that voice is there when we are planning our day, when we are driving, when we are walking, when we are sitting quietly by ourselves, when we are facing a difficult decision, when we make the same mistake one more time, and when we finally learn something from it. It's there when we encourage ourselves. And it's there when we need to call ourselves out. It's there when we are afraid, and it's there when we finally find the courage to do something we've been putting off for a very long time. And maybe that's why I like the idea of thinking out loud so much. Because thinking out loud isn't always about speaking. Sometimes it's about listening. Listening to what we're feeling. Listening to what we're thinking. To what we're been avoiding. To what we've known all along. Because many of the answers we're desperately looking for outside ourselves have been quietly waiting inside us for quite some time. Maybe they are not complete. Maybe they are not final. Not even perfect. But often they're clear enough to help us take the next step. And that's something I've learned over the years. Life is noisy, very noisy. Opinions, advice, news, social media, people telling us what we should do, how we should live, what to eat, what not to eat, what we should think. And in the middle of all that noise, it's incredibly easy to stop listening to ourselves. That's why I think it's important to pause every once in a while, even if it's only for 5 minutes, even if it's during a walk, if it's while having a cup of coffee, even if it's at the end of a long day, and simply ask ourselves, how am I doing? What am I thinking about? What am I feeling? What am I avoiding? What do I need to hear today? Because maybe, just maybe, the most important conversation you need to have this week isn't with another person. Maybe it's with yourself. And if there's one thing I'd like you to take away from this episode, it's simply this. Give yourself permission to listen without judgment, without rushing, without feeling like you need to have everything figured out. Just listen. Because that voice that's been walking beside you every day has something worth saying to. So, if you made it this far, thank you. Thank you for spending this time with me. And thank you as well for spending a little time with yourself. I'll see you in the next episode, and remember, everything is going to be okay.